Zoom or record here. Okay, let me just, I'm gonna keep an eye out for Paul joining us, but it's now noon, so I think we'll begin the proceedings, and I'm sure a number of other people will begin to join and log on as we get going. But good to see everybody's names in my participant window. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Jonathan Neal. I am the director of the Center for Business and Management of the Arts, and I see Paul just joined us, so he should be popping on here. Hi, Paul. How are you doing? I've got to make sure that you're unmuted, though. Hold on one second. Unmute. Hey, Paul.
Hi.
Welcome. We were just getting going. So I'll begin that again. My name is Jonathan Neal. I'm the director for the Center of Business and Management of the Arts at Claremont Graduate University. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome two friends and colleagues, Anat Ebgi and Paul Schimmel. Anat is the proprietor of the self-titled gallery, Anat Ebgi, which we were just before everybody logged on talking about how began right after 9/11 and moved to California in the wake of the financial crisis in 2008. So she is well experienced with crises of one sort of another in the business landscape. And Paul Schimel, who I think for many people on this call will need no introduction, but for a long time, a major player in the curatorial and artistic world of Los Angeles at the Museum of Contemporary Art, and then for a short period with Hauser and Wirth, and now independently as a curator and advisor. I'm very, very happy that you both can join us on this conversation this afternoon.
Thank you for inviting us. And I should also mention that we, 11 years ago, all traveled to Israel together.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Yeah. So I had posted that on my Instagram as a little bit of promotion for this as well. But that's right. With Art Israel, the three of us, along with a number of other people, traveled to Israel and traveled all around the country and spent, I think, 7 or 8 days, which were some of the most exhausting in my life.
But also so interesting. I ended up talking quite a bit to the museum in Tel Aviv, and they wanted me to move there, and I got to know more and more artists, and I realized what was so exciting about Tel Aviv is the sense that a Scud missile could hit any time. You would get a 2-bedroom with a safe room. I realized that it as I think we all noticed, that sense of both presence is sort of here and now, and also the fragility was something we saw in so many artists' work, and how humanity can really flower in periods of great under great stress.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I remember the one great thing you said, Paul, when we were there that I of course still remember, but that how the approach of artists in Israel making work, so much of it is about narrative and storytelling. And that's why there were so many great video artists and artists making things like not the best painting, maybe not the best, but like great works of storytelling.
And photography that had a serial quality to it.
Right. Yeah. I think that's very true. Anyway.
No, I was going to say the exact same thing. There was the energy that was coming out of a lot of the documentary mediums of photography and video and film was quite extraordinary, and sort of, was outdoing the drawing and the painting and some of the other more conventional mediums that we got a chance to see. So I'm gonna go to the personal stuff later on in our conversation, and we'll jump right in it. Do you expect in this same moment of kind of high anxiety and high intensity to see the artists that or people more engaged in a similar type of narrative work and narrative storytelling, and the use of mediums like video and photography as a way to try and get a handle on this?
Yes. And I've been working on a very ambitious history painting show covering from the 60s to the present. And I realized what made the world much smaller is the shared historical events that have occurred and that had a profound effect on artists in different places, even at different times. And I had a kind of a, I meant, well, we know what the last chapter of this history painting show is because probably more than any experience in the history of mankind, not since, the kind of epochal changes that came after the Black Plague have so many artists been so profoundly affected simultaneously. And I mean, I'm thinking about in terms of history painting, but I think you'll see so many artists, whether they are doing performance work or photography or sculpture or painting, that will be addressing this impact. And it could be something from the most personal to the most, in a sense, representational of and something you would call straight up kind of narrative interpretation.
For sure. Anat, you obviously must be in direct contact with your artists. How are they responding, going into hiding, taking a moment of reflection? What does this look like from the kinds of conversations that you have been having?
Well, it's a mixture of some artists, especially the Los Angeles artists, a lot of them are very fortunate to have studios in their homes or their garage, or they're able, to just kind of, be right there or, be able to work from home or very intimately, or just have a studio that is, they're alone in there. But some of my artists that are in New York or other places haven't been able to do that, haven't been able to go to their studios because they've, one of our artists had in the building of her studio, someone that came down with the coronavirus, so they completely cannot even enter the building. So and she cannot, in her work, she needs a studio and she cannot make her work. So it's definitely been mixed, and there's also variation levels of anxiety to new ways of working. But it is fortunate here in LA that a lot of artists already are so isolated. A lot of them have told me that they don't really see the difference. It's been the same. Because that's just how they are in their day. They don't encounter anyone, they don't see anyone, they go straight from home into their car, into their studios. So, that's
the original state of social isolation.
Yeah, LA.
Social distancing.
Yeah, we're used to it.
Like every cliche in the front page of the New York Times talking about how it's a mystery that California doesn't have more cases than one would expect. It's interesting. So much of that also, Paul, what you were talking about in terms of history painting, when I hear that and I think about the great examples of that, I think about the kind of scale that practice takes place on, and it's normally at the scale of the of the monument or the grand, or trying to be equal to the narrative that incorporates the heroic or the state or something like that, even when it's dealing with with negative or difficult subject matter. I mean, you think about something like Picasso's Guernica, and the mural scale as being appropriate to history painting. What do you think that looks like in an age of or a global condition in which we are being kept from one another, and it really is being reduced in some sense down to the individual?
I think photography has had the most profound impact on contemporary history painting, and whether it's Gerhard Richter doing the Bonner Meinhof paintings, or Crosby today doing contemporary historical scenes from both the African diaspora. I think so much relies on photography. And in fact, it's quite interesting to see how, you know, Warhol's race riots were exactly the same image that, you know, was used by other artists, and you know, at the same time. And so I wouldn't even be surprised to see artists moving towards there. And I expect, you know, I like your question regarding what artists are doing now, and because I'm in touch with artists in very different kind of points in their life. And you know, for the painters, it's kind of quite simple. It's sort of like, okay, I'm gonna
just keep going.
Yeah. For high production installations, production for art fairs, sculptural works that involve fabricators, the whole studio practice. And Anat was sort of talking about it on a you know, kind of an individual level. It works quite well, but for these big studios, they have had to make dramatic changes in what they do. And I was having a conversation with an artist who I've gotten to know well over the last 3-4 years, Kari Upson, who has primarily does sculptural work, and her health demanded that she be very kind of rigorous in terms of kind of closing down the studio. And I said, well, she's always done large scale drawings. I said, well, it's a great time to do your drawings. And she goes, nope, I'm painting.
Really?
Yeah. And I went, fucking A, okay, that's great, you know? And I thought, okay, now that's so interesting, because it's sort of necessity will give you permission to do something you wouldn't be doing if you were working on your next show at Spruthmongers, or your next gallery, your next museum exhibition in Basel.
Right, it's the end of the world, so you're going to pick up the one thing you
want
always
to
stay away from.
Work, and it's like, okay, now's the time to start painting. And you know, and I mentioned this to a number of artists that I talked to, and it was like, yeah, right, I can like do whatever the fuck I want, you know? It's like, this is I can switch it up and see what happens.
Yeah.
Is that, Anat, you're hearing the same thing from your artists?
Yeah, I definitely feel a more of a spirit, and that's the beauty about being an artist, is also, you know, you can experiment and be adventurous right now. And it's you know, look, of course I have a gallery, I do a lot of art fairs, you know, I do a lot of this stuff, but there's something really liberating about this moment, not having to produce for every art fair, not having to produce for every, you know, kind of demand, and use this time to play and to experiment. And I'm really encouraging that, you know, to do, because more, you know, we keep hearing it, but it's so true. Really, now more than ever, we need artists to like really guide us and show us the way. And it's not because they have to sell it at some fucking art fair. It's because they have to give us a soul and help us, guide us through this, and not, you know, and so I find this time to be so inspiring, and you know, like, this is kind of why we all are in this, and why we all kind of came to art. We didn't come to art, you know, for all these other things that end up, you know, being part of it, but it's going back to the essentials, back to basics, back to, you know, what's important, what's valuable, and artists now is the time, if they don't, you know, to reflect that, to show that in their work, you know. So
it's a great point. I think I'm reminded of two things. One, even outside of external conditions, I'm reminded of an anecdote where Richard Serra was explaining the reason that he picked up the 16mm film camera back in the 1960s and began experimenting, and said that that really had to do with the example that Warhol provided with his early films and his experiments, and said that that kind of the fact that they had another artist in the immediate generation who was opening up the way and doing these kinds of things was very liberating for an entire group of artists that were then working in the late 60s and the early 70s to experiment across mediums. So sometimes it comes from inside of the arts, and then sometimes, as we often know, and this is part of the conversation that people have been having, it comes from outside with economic conditions. Of course, New York in the 1960s was a place where you could still get by on a kind of part-time job and unemployment and have an apartment downtown and still sort of manage to have a studio and make art 4 or 5 days a week. We know that New York certainly changed and those economic conditions no longer applied pretty quickly. But maybe that's what people see in the wake of various different economic downturns that have an effect on the art community, like the early 90s after the late 80s crash, maybe after 2008 for a brief interregnum, although things seem to come roaring back pretty fast then. There is a widespread feeling that maybe this is a cleansing moment and an opening up to a back to basics, but not to take it in. This is my second point. Not to take it in too pessimistic of a term. There is a lot of damage being done, right? And I think that one of the questions I have is, what are your either prognoses or predictions for the sort of healthy, vibrant, street level world of the arts and the artists who make up a lot of that going forward in the next 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, when a lot of the economy that these people rely on for their gig work, their part-time work, for making ends meet and getting the bills paid is simply, evaporated into thin air over the last month. What do you think is going to happen going forward? Anat, I'm going to put that to you first, and then Paul, why don't you pick up?
Well, there is, I see this very distinctly as like there's a pre and a post, like pre-coronavirus, post-coronavirus. There's a lot of ridiculous things that were happening in the art world, where you could buy a $4,000 painting by some emerging artist, and a few weeks later it's at Christie's selling for $250,000. I mean, really stupid stuff that we have to reevaluate and hopefully not ever go back to. There's overinflated prices of artists, young artists, or I'm not going to name any names. We don't need to name any artist names, but just ridiculous. And this happened also in after 2008. It's happened over and over again, and I think it's time to kind of really stop that ridiculousness. And I think I think there is going to be a correction in the market in many ways, and it's going to affect on all levels. But I do think that it really needed it, and people have been curious as to how it was going to happen. Like, how would this correct itself? I still think people will buy art. I still think people will, invest and have that kind of thing. But I do think that there will be a drastic correction. It's already happening. Hopefully. I mean, it seems like it is. So I also think that there are people as we, I don't want to kind of sound insensitive, but I think a lot of the people who are buying art, continue to buy art, strangely aren't being affected by this. There's levels of money, there's levels of wealth, there's people who are wealthy but have a lot of money in the stock market. They might be feeling a certain way. There's people who are just so wealthy they don't even, and they just continue to buy art and life is the same. So I do think there's also this, and it depends on what sector you're in. Like, I know my husband, who is in distribution, television, you know, doing amazing, busier than ever, because right now, you know, Amazon's doing great and Netflix is doing great and these companies are doing like insanely well, and then other companies, maybe hotels, are not. Anyway, so the point is that there's still a very much inequality in the art world and inequality in who this is affecting. So it's hard to kind of really say, because there's still commerce happening, there's still things going on. So, you know, I just hope that this corrects certain like ridiculous things that, you know, that the art world is known to do. But yeah, so that's kind of like my general thought on it right now.
I'll come back to that. Paul, I want to get your thoughts on where you think we're going to be in 12 months in the overall kind of art economy.
I think the not-for-profit world, which has contributed so mightily in its full range from, you know, artist-type run spaces to small, mid-sized museums all over the world, to the major sort of players, are going through a profound and shocking change. The fact that these institutions, for example, on average, only had a month and a half worth of money in their account to pay their bills, and had to make such drastic changes to their staffing, and that maybe more, in a way, profound in the United States, where we rely on the private sector to a much larger degree than other countries, but everywhere it's changed. The sense of a very measured reopening of museums is going to take place. It will certainly focus more on collection than big loan exhibitions. A lot of major shows that are in the pipeline. Tourism is going to come back very slowly. The kind of international fairs, which we all agree there were too many of, will come back, but there may be maybe half as many as there were beforehand. I mean, huge. I think maybe a third of the not-for-profits may never really reopen. It could be that high if you start putting in private foundations, etc. It's anything that involves visitorship, whether it's a stadium or a museum, is going to have to implement very controlled access. And that is going to have a huge impact on attendance. In the gallery world, you know, it's great to see how everybody has adopted the internet one way or another, and are doing more online sales, and fairs are trying to do. And I look at all of it, and for the most part, it all looks like same old, but we're not doing it for a fair anymore. We're doing it at a cheaper price point for the internet. So I don't see this as like a great avenue forward. I suspect smaller galleries who have very strong regional identities are going to do very well. I felt that in what happened in California. It was enormously liberating in 89, 90, 91. It was a big change. I suspect the bigger galleries are not going to operate nearly as many either locations and fairs that were losses prior to this past period. You just sort of say goodbye. You say goodbye to that sort of stuff. You'll see fewer shows, less publications, and I think one of the real hard things is you'll see galleries having to make really hard decisions about who they represent, and not, you know, stealing from Barbara to pay Alice, so to think. Meaning, you'll see galleries really refocusing on those people that they are able to do the most for, and I think it's going to be very, very disruptive to the scene of how artists being represented. When you take the not-for-profits and when you take the kind of lost leaders out, it's not something that I think even will be resolved in 12 to 18 months. I don't think it's going to fully play out in 12 to 18 months.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I've got a, this might be a somewhat sensitive question, but bear with me. We've seen in the immediate aftermath of the shutting down of the economy, pretty big layoffs and furloughs in a lot of the larger cultural organizations. A lot of that makes sense, particularly for performing arts organizations, which simply aren't putting on the audience-oriented, punctual events that they normally do. Museums have had to do it because they simply don't have audiences coming through their doors any longer. Do you think there's going to be a realignment or a reconsideration about how, at least for collecting organizations that have big stores of assets, of how they reconsider the value of those assets against the value of their, for lack of a better word, human capital, right? The people that make up those organizations and ensure their proper functioning? I can't help, and I'll put my cards on the table, I can't help but think, as I look at how these things are happening across the board, especially for the places that have pretty valuable assets but are otherwise constrained by the codes of ethics from the American Association of Museums and things like that, that there are ways of saving these jobs and saving these people if there were slightly less restrictive and asset conscious ways of thinking about their missions.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to happen. I think having been through a profound crisis at MoCA, where there was at least publicly serious discussion about selling assets, that this is unlikely to change, because the nature of the gifts and its restriction for educational purposes is so profoundly embedded into why people give it, that to, under any circumstance, to change that would really make it very difficult for those collecting institutions to imagine a future where people would continue to donate works of art as for their educational purpose. I think there will be a much greater focus on collection. I think educators will have a more significant impact on the overall program of the museum. I think curators will have fewer and fewer opportunities to do special exhibitions. I think that will have a real impact on many institutions that rely so heavily on special exhibitions. That'll be the slower part coming back, and I expect that a great number of individuals of the more kind of creative type within institutions that are developing programs that are either time-based and or exhibitions and or publications, scholarship, all of that will see a profound impact. Meaning, I expect a great number of these people not to be able to return after they're furloughed, and that institutions will, by nature, refocus on both their assets, the collection, and the community, and how to make an institution operate at a different level vis-a-vis visitorship, because visitorship is going to be impacted. I mean, whether you're going to need a pass card, it's not going to be as easy to go visit a museum, and it's in some ways not going to be as rewarding. But like for all of us, I'll go pretty much see anything, and if they just have the collection, you know, the riches of what we get to see here in Los Angeles at the Getty and the Hammer and LACMA and MoCA and Huntington and the Norton Simon. These are major institutions that are going to see already are seeing significant impacts to their big exhibitions. So I think it's going to be a very slow return. I expect, you know, in some ways, the economy of the art world vis-a-vis auctions, fairs, galleries, in many respects, with all the changes we've been talking about, coming back more quickly as a sort of percentage. And
Sure.
I expect that, yes, of course, things that were overpriced, you'll see, you know, significant reductions, 30%, but maybe this correction was going to happen regardless. There's a sense of that. And, you know, look at oil and look at, I mean, there's, you know,
Right.
commercial, there's a lot of areas that have seen inflated. But the restructuring, I think, is going to be very, I think it will have a real direct impact on our creative community. And I suspect historically, artists here in LA look to places like you, universities, to do employment. But as we well know, universities are increasingly both relying on outside labor, like museums are going to be doing,
Right.
and also doing things online, for which, you know, things are to some degree, well, you recorded one course, let's see if you're going to get paid for it a second time and a third time type of thing. So I mean,
Well, if there's another big sector of the nonprofit landscape that is looking at a big challenge going forward, it is higher education in general.
yeah, and artists who could go and become teachers in 89, 90, 91, that made LA very attractive. And you know, when the New York folks were going, oh, now I am artists, you know, to people like, you know, when, you know, somebody's complaining to Baldessari and saying, you know, in 89, yeah, Lawrence is saying, yeah, now I know why you've been teaching all these years. That's not kind of going to be here to the degree. So I think it's going to be very, very important to remind ourselves how rich our community is right here, and stop looking to foreign lands for it, but to say we have a real base of collectors and artists and institutions, and it's time to, like, you know, double down on really appreciating the value of what you have within your own region.
I couldn't agree more. Anat, I want you to get a note in here also about this alignment of, I think Paul put it nicely, this the alignment or the non-alignment of assets and community. If you think about what our museums represent in their collections and their people, how do you see that playing out? What are the responsibilities of one to the other and vice versa? And then, and everybody who's on the line, I'd also encourage you to think about what kind of questions you have for Anat and Paul, and put them into the chat window, and we'll begin mediating questions if you have any for them going forward. Don't worry, I will play referee. But Anat, on this community and asset question, how does that look like from your perspective? Conversations you've been having with collectors who are also philanthropists and so forth.
Well, Paul and I were talking a little bit before we got on the call, and you know, and this is something I've kind of been thinking about as I've been quarantined at home, and you know, and as far as like the gallery and how to kind of position the gallery and think about these things, and you know, this reality, the truth of a lot of these, you know, museum workers and curators and you know, very smart people, writers, and that have been, you know, either let go of or furloughed, or and how to work with them and bring them into, you know, perhaps, you know, I mean, you know, perhaps these kind of you know, areas, galleries, you know, for-profit spaces, non-profit spaces, museum, like they can start maybe melding together. I mean, Paul and Jeffrey, I mean, these are good examples here in LA of, you know, Jeffrey being a director of museum, and then Paul going over, you know, to Hauser, and these like ways, and maybe that is starting to all kind of come apart, and perhaps, you know, in the gallery, you know, hiring more curators. And I mean, this is something that galleries have done as well, but like, you know, I think, I mean, I know the questions about like the assets of, you know, but that, you know, obviously should remain in museums. And Paul and I were also talking about this idea of like, you know, tiered times of when people go into the museums, and it might not be as busy. But I still think it's really important, the collections and the institutions that we have here. But as far as like the workers go, you know, I mean, we just have to be more creative and more like the artists, more experimental, and have different ways of thinking, getting outside of the profit, nonprofit, for-profit, and just letting go of those things, and it being, again, you know, about the artists and about pushing things forward, and, you know, regardless of, you know, where it's coming from. If that makes any sense? I don't know.
No, I think it does. I mean, it's in many ways an unfair question, and it's also, I think it's also a difficult one to consider, because from my own personal view, I think this is a place where I wouldn't necessarily call it there is going to be a reckoning, but I think that museums have been involved in a few years now of really reconsidering how their missions align with their values, and needing to do some work in terms of rewriting those missions or reconsidering those values. And we see that with what seem like otherwise sort of quaint episodes at the Whitney and at other institutions around the country, about the relationship that those places have to their, not just their workers, but to their audiences and their communities and so forth. I think those,
and to their trustees.
What? You said that again, Paul?
And to their trustees.
And to their trustees, exactly. And so these are, you know, these, as with many places within the art world and the arts more generally, these are places where class hierarchies get quilted together into very proximate points, right? There are very few places in the world where you can have an up from the bootstraps artist with no money background, no real formal education, within the space of a few years find themselves in environments that are populated by individuals with immense means and political and economic power. And that happens on a regular basis in the arts. And I think museums become a flashpoint for those conditions. I think that there are other commercial environments that become flashpoints for those conditions. And I think post-pandemic, these questions and these conditions will really be put further under the microscope in terms of how the institutions are rebuilt, how the value systems are articulated, and what we see coming from the various different players, all the different players involved. I don't know what that looks like. I don't know if it's a full reckoning, but I think that there's a kind of reform that may be on the horizon. But again, I don't know what that looks like. So I've got a question from the audience that I'm gonna throw at you. This comes from Storm Asher, one of our current students. Thank you, Storm. How do you think the market is going to respond to the inevitable wash of coronavirus themed art that is inevitable coming out of this? And what are your personal opinions on that?
What's coronavirus themed art? Like,
oh, wait for it.
Oh God.
Just what everybody's doing while in quarantine. I've gotten a lot of prompts from artists that I work with asking me to pose for a quarantine series picture, stuff like that. And I've seen literal logos of like the virus spreading throughout paintings. It's getting crazy already on Instagram. So.
Huh.
I mean, look, it's like any great historic event. It will be in the hands of brilliance, something that we will remember forever, and in the hands of somebody who is not making some kind of profound statement about art too, probably lost in time. I mean, I think I was very inspired when I did the exhibition, Destroy the Picture, Painting the Void, in understanding what had happened in Italy and in France and in Japan and the United States made all of these artists have some kind of experience that really made them think about, you know, the ends of the earth, world, you know, and then that could be anything from, you know, the World War to the post-war, and the sense that, you know, could blow ourselves up, which we can with the bomb. And there were amazing confluences of feeling, but in the hands of so many different artists, it's as good as the art is.
Mm-hmm. Right. Or work that was made about AIDS during the AIDS crisis, and how, you know, there's some incredible work that came out of that time.
Right, but I think
in some ways, you know, for somebody like David Ronarovich, who I really loved his work before he got AIDS. I knew him in the early 80s, and then because of the AIDS virus, all of a sudden, at a different point, all of a sudden, that made people kind of like get back into and understand his art. This was a long time later, but you realize, oh, I always thought he was a great artist. It took this particular historical event for it to sort of tie back in. But I think it will not be because of, and it will not be in spite of.
Right.
And I think that there's also a content and a form perspective on that too, where I think a lot of the work that we find to be most provocative and most poignant that relates to either previous plague situations. I think the AIDS crisis in the 80s is a good example. A lot of that was not going directly at the thing itself. It came at it on the oblique, or it dealt with conditions that were secondary and tertiary. I mean, I think that Anat's photograph of the sewn together lips as a evocation of the cancellation of voices and the silence equals death logo is one of the more haunting and persistent images of that period, but is otherwise sort of on the oblique, is otherwise abstract, taken in different contexts. It can apply in other situations as well. So those kinds of things I think are interesting. But I also want to mention that things like socialist realism from the 1930s in Russia, which were never given much consideration, which went right to the content and tried to, tell a very specific state-sanctioned narrative, 50 years later become very interesting artifacts, right?
You know what?
Yeah.
I think in some ways what's been great about contemporary history painting is that neither the church nor the state nor the patron owned the history. It was the artist who owned the history. And I suspect the return of state-sponsored iconography, any kind of state, is not something we will ever see to the degree that existed in previous centuries. And yeah, there's interesting shit that came out of China and Germany and Russia that were, state sponsored, but for the most part, yeah. And I think about like great artists working here today, and I can't imagine that, somebody like Nancy Rubens or Carrie Upson or Jordan Wells, I mean, each doing their own very different thing, are not going to, do something rather extraordinary. I think if the artists were at a great period in their life in terms of making their art, that this will inspire them rather than there may be more opportunities in this moment than they would have had if it was business as usual.
I'd love to see what Jordan Wolfson makes out of this.
I'm in touch with Jordan pretty regularly, and she is like, no, look at that. It was like hearing about Jordan, and then Kari, and like she's painting it. I went, God damn, do I love art. It's like, oh, really? I mean, I love your idea for curators, but you're just going to end up with more art advisors.
Yeah.
I mean, because the galleries and the museums and the universities are not going to be able to do as much as they were doing before. And I think it's going to be especially really challenging for a generation of curators, writers, critics, thinkers who are emerging in their 30s now. And I feel like that's whatever challenges we all may have, the challenges of coming of age in a way are really profound. And yet I also think that they may ultimately be the greatest beneficiaries of this change, because the opportunities that can come from below are not going to be so overwhelmed by the shadow cast from above.
Right.
It's going to be this is going to be a tough. Whatever you thought you were going to be doing as you were in your late 20s may look very different by the time you hit your late 30s.
Sure. And also what you thought mattered 2 years ago might matter much less 18 months, 2 years from now.
Mm-hmm.
Although I do think that, not to your point, there, interestingly, and I think it's a correct one, there is still going to be the desire for a class of people to consume these things, to support the artists, to build collections, to amass this stuff. My question is sort of whether it operates at the same level or with the same sort of set of values attached to it as it has in the past, right? Does it continue more now as a gesture of support, which is one of the ways that it's framed, or does it continue in the vein of self-fashioning, which is the other way that I think one could look at it? There are probably many others, but those are the two that come to mind. Do you have thoughts on that?
You know, I think there's also a feeling right now that there's deals to be had, you know, and there's still, there's people who are still obviously building collections. There's advisors that are building collections for people. I mean, sure, there's, as you know, Paul also said, you know, there's plenty of advisors, and they still, everyone kind of is still trying to figure themselves out. But yeah, I think there is a sense of perhaps, you know, of having access to things that you couldn't have access for. Another thing about this online, you know, the Dallas Art Fair, even today, you can go on anyone's page and look at the prices. There's a transparency that's never existed before. You'd have to go through like the most, you know, hardcore vetting to get an answer or see of availability of anything. And now you just click on a thing and you see the price, you see the availability, everything. It's just a total leveling. You know, so there's going to be people who are going to use that for their advantage. There's going to be people who are, you know, like human nature, trying to, you know, get the most.
For sure. So I'm gonna ask one more question. Mark Glimcher penned a kind of personal story for Art News, in which he talked about his kind of his having the virus and the recovery period and the difficulty.
He was actually in my gallery like few days before that, and I'm like,
yeah, what? You didn't tell me? But there's a paragraph at the end of that article which I haven't seen shared around or talked about very much, which a short piece that I want to. This is what I thought was most interesting about what he had to write. And he said, at the moment, we have no choice. This is the quote. At the moment, we have no choice than to be in the business of the present and to reconsider the viability of certain unsustainable practices.
Yeah.
The pricing, the overpromotion, the travel, the relentless catering to the lowest instincts of speculators, the ballooning overheads, the mutually destructive competition, the engineered auction records, and the desperate search for capital to burn just to prove that you can burn it.
Amen.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say it, but my question is, do you believe that all of those things actually get reconsidered and maybe go away? Or do you think they really are just put on pause while we all live in the present of quarantine and come roaring back bigger than ever, because those are the practices and the structures that many in the art world live and die by?
It's very nice to hear him say that. I was really moved by that piece and was like, thank God, like someone put that in writing, and he said what we're all feeling. And I think he wrote it at the darkest days, you know, of the quarantine, the early times when no one knew. I mean, we still don't know, but when we it was such a wonderful thing to read when he wrote it. But I do wonder that, especially a gallery like his that does have to compete at such a high level, how can he really, you know, say that and then come back? How do you really, you know, what if once the world comes roaring back and things are starting, like, are you really fundamentally changing the way you do business, or do you have to compete with the other big galleries? I don't really see that as being, yeah, like it's nice to think about and it's really great in theory, but how do you start making those changes? How is he going to do it in his gallery? Implement those changes.
Right.
Yeah,
well,
especially when you're competing.
On a kind of a, I mean, just Mark Glimcher is the head of one of the 5 biggest galleries internationally, and he has just completed what was $100 million mega
building
expansion in downtown Manhattan, and has facilities all over the world. And I imagine in some ways, you know, even at the very top, they're always looking at, you know, the Joneses. So it's sort of like, you know, well, I'm writing this because Larry Gagosian's even bigger and spends more money and has more, you know, artists, or David Werner's moving up, or Hauser and Wirth have Swiss global, and meaning I don't see that fundamentally changing. I think the biggies are trying to position themselves. So if you're 1 to 5 when it started, you'd like to be 2 instead of 5, or not lose the number 1 position. So it's all relative, and I think each of them are going to have to look at their costs, and like I was saying earlier, and both unfortunately have to eliminate staff, drop spaces that are not producing income, not attend fairs, and most significantly, maybe not like necessarily even dropping the artists, but saying, well, we have less spaces and we have less slots, and therefore we cannot show you for like a while. And so it's not like, necessarily say goodbye to the artists. It's just like okay, but we're not. I mean,
Yeah.
I thought it was a great read, and I really appreciate the heartfelt sentiment. But I saw it more as a kind of a read. It's like, which billionaire after the pandemic is more rich than the other. It's you're still dealing with this very rarefied world that
Right. And at the end of the day, it's about keeping your artists, right? He's got to make sure he keeps his artists and he's not taken by the other ones, and you got to be at that level. It's like so cutthroat because there's always that, there's just so easily, so that's why I think it's like, it was a great read and so nice to hear. But at the end of the day, it's like about keeping the artists, and how do you keep the artists happy? How do you keep, and it's just, I don't know how.
I think that's an interesting point that both of you are making, Paul, maybe inadvertently, but you may see artists who are not at the center of those programs, but not all the way at the edges, may make some choices about moving to some other smaller operations that can provide more opportunities to show and more community, and realize that, the affiliation with one of the big 5 is not the end all and be all, because there are a lot of other very smart, very dedicated, very interesting dealers and galleries and programs out there with their own communities of artists that will do a lot of work, and they could play a role in really helping support and build the infrastructure, right, of diversifying this otherwise totally stratified landscape of commercial galleries.
Yeah.
So we're coming up on our 1 o'clock deadline, and I want to say we have one question here, and we'll put it to you both. Any words of advice or encouragement to students, artists that are just about to be birthed into this post-pandemic world? Fingers crossed.
I think whether or not there's the virus or not, my advice always to recent graduates is you kind of have to, you need 2 years. Give yourself 2 years after graduate school to really find who you are, because I feel like a lot of times in school you have this idea of who you are, this idea of what you're making and what you're doing, and it's really not true. And so give yourself that time, give yourself that break of 2 years. And then after that 2 years, then you should start worrying if you don't know what's going on or what's happening. But give yourself that break, give yourself that time, because there's a lot of confusion, I think. And especially now, of course, so there's no rush, there's no urgency, it's fine. And you just need that time to kind of come down after school, and it usually takes 2 years. I know it did for me.
Thanks. Paul, any final words of advice?
Yeah, I mean, just picking up what I was saying earlier, I think the opportunities that will come up in the next several years may be opportunities that someone just coming out of school never would have had otherwise, and that you really need to kind of, in a way, be open to them. More do-it-yourself than ever. This is the nature of who we are in this city, and it's worked during other periods, but maybe on a more profound level, I think, understand that we now, if the world didn't understand that we are one world, the whole earth, and that we have a sense of both being part of a global community that's never going to go away, that it's only going to get smaller, and that we need to start thinking not just about, I mean, there'll be a tendency, as I was saying, for survival to think kind of, in terms of regions and smaller societies, but that if there's one thing we've learned is the power of what the quote Green Party has been saying all along, and what so many young people really have come to recognize, that that it is every country's responsibility to understand that there really aren't any borders, and that they came out of the great plague, the Black Plague of the darkest period in Europe, into the Renaissance, because ultimately they came off their hilltops, they came into the valleys. So much human resources had been wiped out that trade existed through Europe in a way that had never existed previously, and that the way forward is not through isolation, but through a sense of global responsibility.
I think on that note, we'll close it down. Thank you very much, Anat. Thank you very much, Paul. We really appreciate it. It was a fantastic conversation, and thanks everybody for joining us, and come back to us again and again. This Thursday, we'll be talking with David Pagel from the Los Angeles Times and from CGU, and we'll be back next week too. So again, thank you both.
Send me an invite for the next one. So
for sure. All right, thanks everybody.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.